Birdman. Alright, got that joke out of the way. Today we are painting a Birdman monk. And this video is gonna be more adventure than tutorial. Part of doing these tutorials is just giving you ideas of different ways you can paint miniatures. And in this case, I had to come up with something brand new that I'd never tried before. So let's jump into it and see what happens. We have a Birdman figure here with no feather detail on him, so there's a couple different ways we could paint it. We can just paint it like regular skin, which would be fine, but we already covered that. We could paint it with a kind of fur texture, which also we've already covered. So I tried to come up with something new here, and it was definitely experimental, and it took me about literally 8 tries to come up with something fairly unique. What I ended up doing was trying to recreate different feather textures onto this very tiny miniature using several different techniques. And we're starting off with the head. And a bird normally has very small, short feathers on the head. So to recreate that, we are using simply dots. For the dots, we are using turquoise with more and more white added for the highlights. And I did this 2 different ways. I first tried making the dots more uniform, lining them up, and I just didn't like the look. So instead, I went for more of a random pattern. Our second texture we're going to put on the back, starting at the neck and all the way down. And this is kind of similar to how we painted the fur on the horse video, but instead of doing just a whole bunch of jagged little lines, I'm trying to line them up a bit more. So we're basically doing a band of vertical lines, starting off from the back of the head, and then working our way down towards till we reach the lower back of the figure. We started off with turquoise, but to add some variety here for the highlights, I'm actually switching to Andrea blue. So the turquoise will help tie all the colors together, but then we'll add a little bit of variation to it with different highlight colors. And we are highlighting towards the bottom of each of our little feather bands, so eventually the final highlight will be right over the darkest shade. So we'll hopefully get a little bit of depth showing on the figure. For this stomach, we could have done the same pattern that we did on the back, but at this point on this figure, I decided to just go very experimental and just show possible different ways you can do texture. So instead, I went with more of a stipple pattern, and the stipple pattern here is pretty light. To do it again, I'd probably go a bit more dramatic with the color shifts. Maybe go straight from Scrofulous brown to straight buff, and just do those two. Maybe add a little white at the end. But if I eliminated one of the stippling steps here, then the stippling would be much more dramatic. For the arms, we are using the exact same stippling method that we used on the stomach, but this time I'm using less colors. So the stippling is actually going to be much more dramatic on the arms. Now, I would have personally probably chosen to switch the two, do a more dramatic one on the stomach and less dramatic one on the arms, because the arms are pretty much the smallest surface area on this figure, and you don't want to have a real busy pattern on a very small surface. So the more complex feather pattern that we used on the back, I don't think would work well on the arms. So keep it simple. We're adding a little bit of texture, but we're not overwhelming the surface. Onto the tail now, and doing two different things here. I'm doing kind of slanted lines, and after doing those, I decided there were a little bit too there was a bit too much contrast in them. So I decided to actually, once the lines were established, go back over them with just a straight coat of paint. And because our paint is thin, we're not completely covering up those previous lines. They're still going to be there, they're still going to be evident, but I'm trying to soften them in so they don't look so dramatic. By highlighting, starting over a straight ultramarine blue base rather than the very dark blue undercoat that we started off with, the feather detail is not as sharp or dramatic as it would have been, and in this case I thought it was too much, so that's why we toned it down and hopefully got something that looks a bit more like a realistic feather pattern onto the tail. I did look around for bird photos before painting this, and that gave me a rough idea of colors, but the problem is this isn't a bird, it's a bird guy hybrid, so have to be a little bit inventive with some colors here. We've gotten the turquoise, so we have a little bluish green, we have blue. I did want to add a little bit of violet as well. So starting off with the tail, kind of following the same pattern that we did on the sides of the tail, but this is a little V pattern. So it's tying those two sides together and they come to a point in the center. We have the violet around the tail, but we need to balance that out a little bit with violet elsewhere on the miniature, and I decided to try to put a little bit around the head, and personally I think I did a little bit too much. I probably should have just did a little blotch on where the cheek would be, but I decided to do it around the entire head, which honestly I think was a little bit too much. I did end up cutting back down on it and repainting the yellow on the cheeks because I just didn't think it was proper to where it was. Speaking of repainting, I also redid the legs. I decided to go for more yellow because there was already a lot of blue on the figure, and to paint the whatever, I don't know what you call them, but little plates on their feet. We're using a mix of Beasty brown and Scrofulous brown, because I didn't want those to stand out too much, so we're going with minimal contrast there. We're pretty much done with painting the bird himself. Now we have to talk about painting the robes, and I'm just going to cover a couple of the areas, but I want to let you know that basically everything else I'm trying to paint brown. And the reason for that is we have so many colors on the body, on the feathers, that I really felt that it needs something more neutral, more bland. Because if we started painting the robes very bright colors as well, bright red or yellow or what have you, our color balance is going to be way, way off on this figure. And it already is kind of off because we have a lot of bright colors on the top and then browns on the bottom, but just because of the nature of the figure, there's not a whole lot we can do about that. While I want to stick with neutral colors and earth tones, I don't necessarily want to just paint everything straight brown. And for example, on his skirt, we're going with charred brown and flat brown because that has a little bit of red in it, but it's not bright red. It's not going to be enough to clash with the colors that we used for the feathers. So we are adding a little bit of color, but we're still staying in that neutral, non-distracting tone. This figure is so busy with the fur pattern, I specifically didn't want to add any texture to the robes or the skirts, but I'm going to add a little bit to the staff. This is a very simplified version of how to do a wood grain, but we start off with Camo Black Brown, a very dark brown color, and just draw lines of flat earth over that. And they don't have to be very straight or anything. You can actually vary the thickness of them as well. You just kind of want to draw a squiggle line up and down your wood surface. And then once that's established, go over it with a lighter brown, in this case using yellow ochre. And you don't necessarily have to cover the entire line. Basically, you just want to highlight it a bit, try to get on the inside. And if needed, you can go back to your original very dark brown and clean up in case there was any errors. Normally I would have another step in here, another highlight, but because this staff is so small, I'm just going to use 3 colors here rather than using 4 or 5. And there is our finished Birdman Monk, and thank goodness he's done. I'm not kidding, I repainted this figure about 8 times trying to come up with something new. You're lucky, you could paint yours however you want, but my job is to show you something new. Again, you have a lot of options. You don't necessarily have to do something as complex as this. Could paint it as a regular layering technique, paint it like skin. We could paint it like fur, but I really wanted to try something new and show you something a bit more unique, and it's minorly successful. I don't really want to paint this figure for a 9th time, so we'll just call it quits there. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Bye-bye.